Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm just going to give it a minute as usual so that we can make sure everyone who wants to has a chance to join us. You can access the prompt that we're working on today by going to the link in this title slide or in the video description if you want to look at that. We'll just give it about a minute. We'll just give it a few more seconds here and then we're going to get started. Once again, you can access today's resources at the link in this title slide or in the video description. All right, let's go ahead and begin. I'm Dawn Knight. I'm an English teacher from Westfield High School in Indiana. And we're going to start today by going over the AP exam practice from yesterday. Don't worry if you didn't do the lesson, it'll still be beneficial to you. But if you didn't do the lesson, you might want to pause the feed here just to read through the passage. That way it'll make a little bit more sense to you and be a little more beneficial. We're going to go ahead and continue with the warm up, and you can press play whenever you're ready to join back in. For this practice, I asked you to read and study the prompt and to annotate for rhetorical situation and patterns in organization. And since I can't see yours, we'll look at an example. You'll notice that some of the rhetorical situation is revealed in the prompt itself. We see the speaker, Richard Louv, that this was a passage from his book and that he's making an argument about the separation between people and nature. In the body, there's an introduction that includes a hook about choosing the colors of a butterfly wing to start to show how technology has impacted the audience's relationship with nature. Then it moves into the first body paragraph where there's a claim that the connection to nature is worse than ever, with an anecdote to illustrate it. This is made more evident in the next body paragraph with rhetorical questions. Then there's a shift to the past to show the difference between kids today versus kids then. There's another shift almost immediately after that to the future, during which his overall message is made a little more clear that technology is causing us to lose our connection to nature. I also noticed a sarcastic tone throughout and wondered at the effectiveness of that tone. But there's also a more nostalgic tone at the end that I felt might even be a little more effective. So now let's delve deeper into the patterns that we noticed and the rhetorical situation. If you look back at the slide, I'm just going to go back one more time here. So you'll notice that in green, I have present at the top left corner there in green. And then on the right columns, I have a shift to past and shift to future. So that was one of the patterns that I noticed. There were also anecdotes for comparison. So there seemed to be kind of a comparison pattern as far as the organization goes. Some rhetorical questions, and then, like I said, the sarcastic and nostalgic tones. As far as the situation, we had the speaker, Richard Louv. The audience was Americans. The purpose to convince them that technology is causing them to lose their relationship with nature, particularly children, seemed to be a focus. And then the message was that maybe Americans need to reconnect with nature. But again, we have to go beyond that when we actually write a rhetorical analysis essay and think about what that means. Was it effective? Was the tone effective in illustrating the message? What about the anecdotes, the rhetorical questions, things like that? Okay, now let's take a look at what we're doing today. So today we're looking at developing a paragraph to support a line of reasoning, how to include specific examples for support, and commentary to explain how the example supports the claim and connects to the thesis. And you're actually going to be doing another lesson over commentary. So today we're going to really go over what should be in the paragraph and what that might look like, but you'll also have some more lessons on some of the more nuanced pieces of that paragraph. Okay, so here's what you need to know. First, just a reminder, you'll have 45 minutes to write the rhetorical analysis essay for this year's test. And we have a general timeline that we've been sharing with you about how you might want to organize that time. So you should study the prompt and annotate the passage. That should be a total of about 10 minutes. Writing the intro and conclusion about 5 minutes each. And that gives you about 25 minutes to write the body paragraphs. Today, we're going to focus on some ideas to help you develop good body paragraphs in that short amount of time. It's not a short amount of time. But when you have some ways to organize it that you know you can kind of plug in, it'll help that go a little more quickly, but still be effective. Okay, so yesterday we talked about the rhetorical situation and its importance in analyzing the choices that writers make. However, it's also important to consider this in your own writing. So, you should consider your audience and purpose as you make decisions about word choice, tone, and evidence, for example. So, even though we're focused on writing that rhetorical analysis essay right now, this is something to consider in whatever situation you're writing for. You may also remember this chart from an earlier lesson on argument. You're essentially making an argument when you write a rhetorical analysis essay. You're convincing your audience that your thesis is valid. So, your thesis should be an answer to the prompt. And then today we're going to focus on writing a good body paragraph that supports that thesis. And if you look at the chart, you see each body should be organized around a reason or claim, and it should include specific evidence to support your thesis. But that alone doesn't make a good body paragraph. So let's look at what that might look like if we were writing a body paragraph of the rhetorical analysis of that Friedman passage from yesterday. And even if you didn't see yesterday's lesson, this will make sense. But you can also pause here if you want and look back at that passage. So here's reason and evidence. Friedman appeals to the patriotism of his audience. He does this by comparing the US to other countries. He writes, in most industrialized nations, not least of all our economic rivals in East Asia, a kid who studies hard is lauded and held up as an example to other students. He compares American professors to those in other countries where professors enjoy prestige and reward. So here's reason and evidence, but let's look at what we can do and layer in to make this a much better paragraph. So if you look at the top of the slide here, the very basic format for a body paragraph would be to include a claim, which we did have in that paragraph that I just showed you, and evidence, which is support to show the audience. But that's really not enough. We also need an explanation of how the evidence supports the claim, and then a connection to the thesis. So we can always focus back on that thesis that we're trying to prove, that we're trying to show is valid. So some teachers may have also used an acronym with you, and I showed just a couple of examples here, but there are many others. I've also heard hamburger paragraphs. There's like a bun and a hamburger and lettuce. I don't know. So whatever works for you is good. But peel and axes are two of the ones that I've seen quite often. Again, they're just acronyms to help you remember those four things that should be in it. It's the same four things. So the assertion is the same thing as a claim. It's your reason. You need an example, that's your evidence. And then an explanation of that example and the significance, how it connects back to thesis. Or for Peel, your point, your reason, evidence, explanation, and the link that connects it back to the thesis. So these are all the same. Using one of the acronyms can be helpful to remind you of the elements that should be included in each paragraph. I encourage my students to try to include more than one piece of evidence if they can, just to strengthen their argument whenever possible. So if one of these you feel like works for you, maybe jot it down, pause here, jot it down, and see if that's something that can help you. I think the CEEC is also easy to remember. All right, let's write a better paragraph that includes all of these elements. So we're going to start with a claim, our assertion or point. I use all three of those that I just showed you to lay this out. In the body paragraph, we're going to focus on Friedman's choice to use comparison. So Friedman appeals to the patriotism of his audience. He does this by comparing the US to other countries. Now we need an example or evidence to support our claim. He writes, in most industrialized nations, not least of all our economic rivals in East Asia, a kid who studies hard is lauded and held up as an example to other students. Friedman explained earlier, even at a prestigious academic institution like Harvard, anti intellectualism is rampant. He compares American professors to those in other countries where professors enjoy prestige and reward. Notice that there are a couple of examples here of Friedman comparing the US to other countries, which supports our claim. I also want to point out here that some of the evidence is in direct quotes, but some is paraphrased. Either way, you need to cite it, but you don't always have to use direct quotes for every single piece of evidence. And even with the evidence, though, this paragraph isn't really complete. We need to know what about it. We need explanation to show how the evidence supports the claim. So let's layer in another piece. The typical American takes pride in the fact that America is a major economic player in the global economy. The idea that its place may be in danger would surely appeal to their patriotism, maybe even causing a shift in the way they see intellectuals, not as circus freaks, but as the very foundation of the country's status. So here it is with an explanation of how the evidence supports the claim. But we also still need to connect it back to the thesis to really support and show why our argument is valid. So here's what that might look like. Friedman's use of comparison is an effective way to appeal to the patriotism of Americans and persuade them that they must shift their priorities from athleticism to intellectualism if the US is to remain a global player. Now, what else does it need? Keep in mind that you want these paragraphs to flow, and that one was just a little bit choppy. There might be a sentence after the claim leading into the evidence and a transition from the explanation of one piece of evidence into the next piece of evidence. In other words, these acronyms that I showed you remind us what to include, but we shouldn't just drop items in. We also want to look at fluency, how we can connect them and tie them together. So you can do this in some ways just with sentence structure, with syntax, by varying your sentence structure and connecting sentences by using complex or compound sentences. We talked a little bit about that, I think, in Unit 8 with Mrs. Velitis. And I think we're going to review it again in a later lesson as well. But you can also use transitions, and you've seen this slide before as well. These are some commonly used transitions. There are a lot of them, and if you Google it, you can easily find more. But these will help you connect some of those ideas and sentences inside your paragraphs. So now let's look at the paragraph again, this time with transitions. One of the ways Friedman conveys his message that the US can't compete against other countries or remain a world power if it doesn't stop emphasizing athleticism over intellect is by appealing to the patriotism of his audience. He does this by comparing the US to other countries. For example, he writes, in most industrialized nations, not least of all our economic rivals in East Asia, a kid who studies hard is lauded and held up as an example to other students. This is a stark contrast to the US, where Friedman explained earlier, even at a prestigious academic institution like Harvard, anti intellectualism is rampant. Additionally, he compares American professors to those in other countries, indicating that while Americans value professional athletes more, in other countries it is professors who enjoy that kind of prestige and reward. The typical American takes pride in the fact that America is a major economic player in the global economy. The idea that its place may be in danger would surely appeal to their patriotism, maybe even causing a shift in the way they see intellectuals, not as circus freaks, but as the very foundation of the country's status. Clearly, Friedman's use of comparison to appeal to patriotism is an effective way to persuade the American people that they must shift their priorities from athleticism to intellectualism, or at the very least, to stop being anti intellectual. So notice here it starts off with one of the ways, which would be a good transition from our thesis statement at the end of an introduction to our first body paragraph. Also notice that there are transitions leading into each example with for example, that leads us into the very first one and then additionally leads us into the second. There's even some explanation after the first example that helps lead into the second one and explain a little bit of its connection to the first. Um, and a transition leading out of the explanation and into significance. So, this whole thing makes the paragraph flow much better, even though we didn't add a whole lot to it, but it makes a big difference in the way it sounds. So now we have all the elements of a great paragraph. And if we were writing the complete essay, we could start the next body paragraph off with a transition to even something very easy like another way Friedman conveys his message, or another choice Friedman makes in order to convey his message is. Okay, so today we looked at developing a body paragraph that supports a line of reasoning. We included specific examples for support and included commentary to explain how the examples support the claim and connect to the thesis. And then finally, we layered in a little bit of transition just to make the whole thing flow a little bit better. All right, now let's take a look at today's exam practice. You can find this exam practice in the resources link in the video description. For this practice, we're going to use the Louvre passage that you annotated for yesterday's assignment. If you didn't annotate it yesterday, you'll want to do that first. Remember, you should be able to read and analyze it in about 10 minutes. Write a thesis statement first that answers the prompt, because that's what you're going to use to focus your body paragraph on. And that's what you're going to support in your body paragraph with evidence. You can access this assignment in the resources link in the video description. I won't be here tomorrow. Mrs. Velitis will be with you again. So I will see you back here on Monday. In the meantime, stay active, stay healthy, and remember that there are a lot of us out here who care about you. Okay, thanks so much.